Welcome, Joseph Alexander, to the Kundalini Connection.
Welcome,
Thank you. Thank you.
Joseph.
Today, we are joined by Joseph Alexander, who is a researcher on mythology. And Joseph, what is your blog site again?
It's www Mythic Spiral, MYTHICSPIRAL. And I have about 15 articles on different subjects, but the main idea is how the symbols that are in fairy tales and religion are very similar, if not meaning the same. So.
What I really liked about Joseph is that he came into my life at a time where I was already kind of studying the myths. And it was interesting because I'm pretty sure many of you have heard of Joseph Campbell. So when I met Joseph Alexander and he was doing in the same thing, I was like, whoa, like, have you heard of Joseph Campbell? He's like, yes, I have. But um, I believe with Joseph here is different what he's bringing in. Joseph Campbell, he covers really interesting areas. You know, like the whole process, the hero's journey, I believe it's called, and it's the separation, the process that one goes into, the separation, the initiation, and then the return. But Joseph over here has other very interesting observations that he made from myths, and that's what really has helped me even evolve further, is understanding what these myths do to yourself, how they help influence your life if you let yourself be guided by them.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And not just that, the big concept is that civilization itself is based on mythology. Right? In a sense,
Yeah,
you can't find a culture that doesn't have a narrative.
exactly, a creation myth and all that good stuff.
Right. And I sort of broke to get even the big picture of it. There's three different types of domains or categories that mythology falls into. One is the celestial sphere. In other words, the sun gods, everything that happens above the earth, the creation of the planets, creation of all the different personalities.
Mhm.
The second division of mythology is the personal. And that's what basically Joseph Campbell
Right,
concentrated when he says the return of the hero. It's all about the hero is a personal concept.
right.
A lot of myths are about creation of the world.
Yeah.
The gods are different. And then the third one, so you got to think of three layers. It's like three-dimensional chess. You know, everybody's playing checkers, and the myths are three-dimensional. So the bottom one is terrestrial. So those are all the mythologies about the fertility of the earth.
Mm.
And so it was like Demeter's is taken down into hell, into Hades,
Mm.
by Pluto. And that's the whole idea of summer disappearing. And then her mother, Persephone, has to agree to Pluto that for 6 months of the year she's above Earth and 6 months underneath. So that myth's about the fertility of the Earth. Now the problem with all things like different interpretations is when everybody looks at it through a psychological point of view, like Jung or Freud, where he talks about sexual repression. The other two divisions are missing.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's getting complicated, but the whole idea is like, if you look at the Egyptian myths are probably the best way you can see it on three different levels. Like the sun is born at the end of the year. It's born on the winter solstice. That's on the celestial level. Ra comes up, and then Set, the gigantic serpent, tries to kill it, the darkness. So it's between the dichotomy between light and darkness. Well, on a personal level, you're like all the Christ and all the divine children are born on Christmas the same time. So that's the same thing. It's becoming enlightened on Christmas. Gopi Krishna actually had a Kundalini awakening on Christmas night.
Right.
I had the same thing. because we're actually connected to the earth. That's the easiest way to raise your Kundalini.
Mm.
You brought up some words here, Kundalini. And then you're talking about these different levels or layers of myth, right?
Right,
So
right.
it sounds like what you've done is you've taken these three layers, and the way I'm seeing it is you have the person in the middle, you have the earth, the terrestrial layer below, and then you have the kind of celestial
Exactly.
of kind of this like holistic way of
Right.
the myths. But then you've also brought in Kundalini. Like, how do you relate Kundalini and the myths? Like, what is the connection there?
Well, if we keep on these three levels and symbolism, if you look through all the different myths, there's always the serpent. So the serpent represents the movement between matter and spirit. So anytime you see Kundalini coming up, it's the feminine force, which is the earth force. And it's going up to the sky, which is God force, the sun god. But it goes through us, goes personally, goes in each one, on each level. So people see the serpent and they interpret it on one level, but it's on three different levels. But anyways, the serpent goes upward, which is Kundalini, which is pranic energy within your body. It's the force. It's how consciousness works, basically. It works through prana, which is a subtle energy that pervades the whole universe.
Mm-hmm.
But it's everywhere. But the change to make evolution work, it spirals upward, just like you put a seed in the ground, it comes out of the earth. It goes upward towards the sky, and the sun makes it blossom. Then when it dies, it falls back down with new seeds. Mm-hmm. When a human being, it goes upward, you become enlightened. But the other part is like what Joseph Campbell was saying, you come back. It's the return.
Yeah.
The return of the spiritual energy into your body to spiritualize it.
So you can't just attain enlightenment and just hang out in
Nirvana
or heaven.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, there's nothing besides right here. I mean, you can't. Heaven is right here.
Right.
If you want to spiritualize it, I mean, even if you have this intuition or this experience of nirvana, you're still in your body, right?
Because a lot of cultures, they look at nirvana and heaven as kind of the end goal, and once you get there, your work is done. Right.
Well, that's the whole problem. Aurobindo really he really brought that out. How it's not just that. It's Christianity. It's a lot of them. They think you're going to die, and that's the end of life. But your consciousness is infinite. So how is it going to? It cycles. Everything cycles. It's going to just return and return. There is no end. Just there's no beginning, and people can't wrap their mind around that because your mind is only limited, but your being is infinite.
Yeah, it seems to me like oftentimes the idea of heaven or nirvana is in a way perverted, and what I mean by that is people think, well, I've offered my life up to Christ, and so therefore I'm going to get into heaven, and therefore my work here is done. I don't need to evolve myself or do anything else because I've already got the promise of heaven.
Or I like Constantine's take, right? Like he just did all these harm, and then just before death, he was
absolved.
Yeah, and all of a sudden it's all good.
Yeah, well, if you look into the whole concept of how this came about, it's through the Roman Empire, and they spent 1,500 years destroying all the libraries and all the concepts of reincarnation. I mean, it wasn't just the Library of Alexandria that was destroyed. There was a Library of Apollo in Greece. All of Greek culture was destroyed. And basically, our way of government and all our concepts came from Hellenistic civilization. Mm-hmm. And they got theirs. I mean, they studied, Sicily. They don't realize what it was 2,000 years ago. Almost every god you can trace from Greece came from India, because they didn't really invade it, but they were Buddhist in Alexandria, Egypt. They were teaching back then. So all these concepts were well known. And India is well known for the basic belief system is that your soul is immortal, and this is an education. It's not one time like you flunk first grade and that's the end of it. You're kicked out of school forever. You just keep going and going and going. And the whole thing is to increase your consciousness until your whole body is filled with light. And you have more and more freedom as you're more and more conscious.
So earlier you were talking about the relationships between fairy tales and religion. And like in your blog posts, you've taken some pretty revolutionary kind of approach to interpreting these stories, right? I guess, what do you like in your mind? What is the biggest misinterpretations, or the, how are we looking at myths or even religion, incorrectly? Like, what is the way that you go doing things? Yeah.
Linda, you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest that you probably answer that question with the virgin birth.
I'll tell you one explanation, and then I'll get to that.
Okay.
A lot of, in general, the fairy tale is about being on a path to enlightenment and putting aside pleasures and the materialism to stay on a straight and narrow path. I mean, just like, and what happens in the Western point of view, everybody takes it as culturally, because like during the French, when Charles Perrault wrote a lot of the fairy tales, they had a culture, so it was influenced by that. And all the scholars interpret the fairy tales from psychological point of view, which they're right to a certain extent. And just like Joseph Campbell, it's about the personal hero.
Right.
I go further and I say it's about the divine child. One of the reasons they're always portrayed as a child is because the child represents the human soul as it reincarnates through different different times, and it's going towards enlightenment. So like Little Red Riding Hood, it's a really simple, but the scholars themselves can't figure out how come after 5,000 or 10,000 years people are still interested in this, because it's so quaint. But the real idea is that she's a soul, and her mother told her, now take this bread and wine, like what Christ had, and give it to your grandmother, and stay on the path, and don't be dissuaded by anything. And so as soon as she gets on the path, the wolf appears, which is the adverse force, or sort of like the devil. But in mythology, the wolf represents materialism. It represents Kronos, or Saturn. And that planet Saturn is the lowest of the 7 metals. It represents lead. So really it represents materialism. So she's on the path, she meets the wolf. The first thing he does is convince her to go pick flowers, And so he runs and swallows up the grandmother. And the whole idea of picking flowers, they interpret it in more than one way. They interpret sexually. When I say they, it's like Jung, and there's Frank Zipes, which is a famous mythologist of fairy tales. They interpret it as deflowering or sexual. And in other words, the wolf represents the wolf part of the masculine. And there's all sorts of different versions of this, where Little Red Riding Hood gets to the grandma's house, and the wolf has her take off all her clothes and jump into bed with her. And it gets really dark. But the whole idea, he swallows up the grandmother, right? Then he swallows up Little Red Riding Hood. Then the huntsman comes, and he cuts the wolf's stomach and takes her out. And basically, that's the whole idea, being swallowed up by materialism, then being resurrected. So it's the soul falling into matter and coming back up and being resurrected. But the real trick, this is the real interesting part, because it's the same thing as Snow White. The questions that she asked the wolf, what a big teeth you have. And he says, the better to eat you. What big eyes you have, the better to see you. And so each one of those questions are about the 5 senses. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically she's swallowed up by the five senses, in other words. And that's the whole symbols behind that. And those questions are asked again in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You know, she gets into the dwarf's house and she tries one plate, because, you know, it's too small. She tries some water, and that wasn't the only thing that really worked. What was the last bed that she fell asleep in, which was the seventh bed, which represents the seven chakras. So in other words, Snow White goes to the seven dwarfs, which are the seven chakras, but the only one that really was able to sleep was the seventh chakra. So I mean,
That's interesting.
So like, I mean, that interpretation, I think of, you know, Joseph Campbell, like Linda was talking about, and you know, he's always looking at things from this hero's journey, right?
Right.
Kind of almost like a metaphor or analogy, right? Where someone goes out and has an adventure, comes back with some new knowledge, that type of thing. But you're looking at it from the perspective of a spiritual awakening, or
right. They become awakened, and they get gifts all the time too. It's not just they go, well, you can say the same thing about the hero, but my perspective is a little bit bigger. And it's more accurate, because one third of the fairy tales came directly from India. I mean, there's fairy tales directly about the Brahmin's son who was born as a snake. And so a lot of them are, like a lot of fairy tales, they all end in a sacred marriage of the female and a male. That's the marriage of the item Pingala within inside you. And that's how the fairy tales end. And there's so many that are clear signs related to Kundalini, not so much as a hero going out and getting a prize and coming back.
The Ida and Pingala, Joseph, can you define that for us?
Well, traditionally in yogic literature, you have two energies, basically, that everybody's made. Well, there's three energies. The Ida is the feminine energy that spirals up your spine. It's like a nerve plex or nadis, they call it. And your bioenergy spirals through that side. And then on your right side is the Pingala, which is the masculine. And that's sort of the heating, and there's the cooling. And as they form little X's or triangles on your spine, that's where your chakras are. Which are little swirls of energy that comes out. And each of those seven chakras are related to different levels of consciousness.
And you could also say maybe those are related to the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system as well.
Right. So, I mean, everything in the world is he and she. There's a male and a female. And the whole thing is to develop those, because in the fairy tales, the bottom chakras won't get you to enlightenment. It's only when the top one. There's a lot of them like that. There's like the seven ravens. She has, the young daughter is born, and her seven brothers disappear. I mean, the father curses them because they didn't bring back water in time enough to baptize their daughter. The daughter represents the seventh chakra. So the ravens fly away, and she spends her life looking for them. So that whole concept is that the energy went up to the seventh chakra, her head, that's the woman. Now she has to go back and find to come back to the earth again and bring that spiritual energy back. That's the whole concept, right? And in a very short idea.
So in hearing you talk, I'm hearing that, you know, and I keep thinking about Joseph Campbell, because he's probably the best known mythologist, you know, of modern times. And, you know, the way that he was looking at things regarding hero's journey and just his general perspective on myth is that myths are there to help us kind of cope with the things that we deal with day to day, you know, to give us courage, to give us, you know, what we need to just deal with life, and also with spiritual matters. But then what I'm imagining here is that is like a subset of this larger perspective that you're
exactly. Because anything that's abstract has to use a symbol. I mean, you think about it. So, I mean, everybody looks at things just through your senses, but to understand what it means, you have to have a symbol or a motif or something you have to use basically something in the physical world as a symbol to represent the invisible world.
And
But it has to be symbolized. Go ahead.
where I keep thinking about also is when you mentioned Kundalini and its relationship. I mean, Kundalini is the evolutionary force working within all of us to kind of drive us to higher consciousness and really shaping all aspects of our life. And what you're saying is that the myths are primarily related to this spiritual awakening, this evolution. Really, is that myths are kind of these, um, symbolic of this evolutionary process on the whole, rather than just where Joseph Campbell was looking at, just almost like in a way, like a material way of looking at things. Your perspective is a little bit broader and takes into account this evolutionary process, this Kundalini process.
Exactly. And not just all the modern Western well, I wouldn't say all of them. There are some people who are bringing some of these ideas out. There's a couple books on it by different PhDs, but they're not well known. But like Freud and Jung, and they admit that it's spiritual. A lot of them, especially Jung, but they don't have the connection. And the biggest problem I saw is some of it's just, I just hate to say it, but it's poor research. I mean, India is the largest civilization in ancient times, and it's well known. Back in the 1890s, like Joseph Jacobs, who researched it, he said 1/3 of the fairy tales came from India. So if they came from India, they had to use their philosophy.
Right.
And so they admit that they came from India, but they won't delve into it and study it. Basically.
Well, I think the difference there, Joseph, is not poor research, but also, they didn't have a Kundalini awakening, just like you have. You have that energy flowing through you. You know the signs, the effects, and you've seen it throughout your own life, and so it's really easy for you when you look at these stories to be able to decipher them, at least from when I go in and I read your blog and I'm like, wow, I never thought about that. Like, I was reading Jack and the Beanstalk for my boys, and it was like, when you told me it was a myth, I was like, how is that a myth? And I read it in your blog and I was like, wow. And I think it's because you have the awareness. You have something that they didn't have. And I'm assuming it's that energy running through you in a way that perhaps we can argue that they had it too. But
yeah, how did your Kundalini awakening experience kind of fuel your interpretation of myths or shape your interpretation of myths?
Well, I was writing, I had like 100,000 word book on the myths, but it was getting so complicated. Then I started reading the fairy tales, and like they were simpler in the sense that I already had the blog written, so I'll just turn it into a book. So I started to do that. And then the more I read it, the deeper I got into it. It's an ongoing process.
yeah.
So you're reading abstract myths. It's like you're educating your brain, because when you use your right brain and you're like memorizing formulas and engineering and computers, is entirely different from subjective. I could read the myth, read it a year later, and I get more intuitions, then more. And this has been ongoing. I mean, that's how come it took me so long to write this. It's been like 5 years I've been working on my book.
So the Kundalini process inside of you kind of helps you, like you can reflect inwardly, and you kind of see the relationship between these.
Well, this is like a back and forth between a myth, and I find something that, what does this mean? And I sit and meditate on it, think about it, come back to it, like maybe a month or so, all of a sudden, Jack and the Beanstalk. The beanstalk is the spine. He climbs up the spine, and he has to kill the ogre, because the ogre is his evil self, his projection. See, all the different characters in mythology and in fairy tales are basically a projection of the main character's soul or psyche. So they're projected outward so that we can see it like a whole paradigm of the evil stepmother is the ego of like Cinderella. Her two sisters in Cinderella are the Ida and Pingala. At the very end of the myth, their eyes are poked out, actually. And that's because when your eye becomes single, you become enlightened. That's because the Ida and Pingala are balanced and you don't need them anymore because the energy is going through your center. So there's all these different things that are much more accurate than the whole idea of just a hero. You know, how could Cinderella be a hero, really? Right. I mean, they all marry and live happily ever after, you know, a big gold castle or something. That's not really the concept of a hero to me. You know? So but I really broke it down. If we're going to keep talking about fairy tales, I just like Joseph Campbell has 17 different motifs or categories. I broke the fairy tales down to like there's 10 of them, and they're all very interesting. And those same 10 can almost be same thing applied to mythology. And the number one motif is really interesting. It's the evil in mythology, the evil king or evil ruler. In fairy tales, it's the missing parents. The parents disappear. Like in Walt Disney movies, there's 27 fairy tales where there's no mother. And the same thing in a lot of other fairies that he didn't make movies out of. But, you know, like Cinderella, her mother dies, and all of them. Snow White, her mother tries to kill her. And the whole idea is that's the ego inside of the person. But it's also there's like 3 or 4 different levels to this.
Yeah.
So you had, you know, in going through the myths, had identified some major symbols, like in addition to what we were just talking about. And your interpretation of them, I think, was a little bit different than what I've seen in the past, really anywhere. So like the virgin birth is one of them,
right?
You identified. Can you talk about that one? Like, what does that mean from a Kundalini awakening or from a metaphysical standpoint?
Yes.
Well, I'm gonna mention the four almost. If you understand these 4 symbols in relation to Kundalini, you can understand about 90% of all the myths. One is the virgin birth. The other one is the goddess. Then there's the tree. Then there's the fruit of the tree, which is like apples or whatever it is. And the whole idea of those is the goddess represents Kundalini. That's the earth force. That's related to the tree. You always see the serpent in the tree. That's the goddess in the tree. That's Kundalini going up the tree. And the tree is a symbol of the spine. You know, it's on different levels. There's a world tree, but from the perspective of evolution, of personal evolution, that represents Kundalini. Just like Cinderella gets all her fruits from her gifts from the tree. And then there's the fruit of the tree, which is like the apple, whatever it is. That's the gifts you get from Kundalini. And the virgin birth is all through ancient yogic literature and through all the ancient mysteries. The whole idea was that your sexual energy, instead of going outward into the physical world, it should go inward and upward into your brain. So they call it sublimating your sexual energy. And they like the whole idea of the snake biting its tail. It's the whole symbol of the serpent going upward, becoming a light, and then coming back down to earth. So, and there's more than one way to look at the virgin birth. I mean, you can look at virgin as just, you have to be chaste and pure and keep your mind on God. You can look at it as just like virgin snow. It's untouched. And you're being purified. And in other different, I just lost you. Hold on a second here.
We're still here. Can you hear me?
Okay. There's so like in the Greek myths, there's all these different castrations. It's really interesting. The first god, or Uranus and Rhea, were the first gods who created everything. They created the Titans. And Cronus, the son, the last son, castrated his father. And then he became head of the Titans. Mm-hmm. And it repeats, then Zeus castrated him. Then Zeus swallowed his wife, and then Athena was born out of his head. The whole idea is the idea of moving away from the previous generation is about evolution. The father figure has to die, but it's in a mythical sense. You know, you're progressing above the father, or else you just be in a circle, because evolution is a spiral. You keep going further.
Yeah, so it's like healing past
your karma, your ancestors' karma.
Yeah,
the way people think. It's the whole generation gap. That's what it is. It's evolution. But they put it in a myth as castrating, because castrating is like the sexual energy is gone and the previous generation loses it, more or less, because they're old ideas.
Right.
It's sort of like a tree, like a tree that dies. You know, what happens is the new apples fall down, but the old tree dies. Mm-hmm. Then a new cycle comes on. So, like the very first god in Uranus, you know, he's castrated, and what happens is phallus falls into the ocean, and out of the white foam, Aphrodite is born, the goddess of beauty. Mm-hmm. And that is Saturn, all right? That's Cronus. But I mean, in the Roman myth, it's Venus. You know, the beautiful painting of Botticelli. You have Venus; she's on a shell coming from the ocean. Well, that's what they're talking about. See, the Romans took all the Greek myth. They didn't have their own religion. They just copied everything from Greece. And Greece got most of their ideas from India. And also, they admitted it. Right? I'm sorry, go ahead.
And also Egypt, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. One of the greatest of the 7 sages of Greece studied Egypt for like 20 years.
Wow.
Trying to think of his name. But back then, it wasn't. This is only modern Eurocentric that the Greeks invented everything. The Greeks themselves. Yeah. There's some interesting books. The Greeks themselves admitted that they learned everything from other people. Mm-hmm. They were centered. It wasn't like there's this little Greece nation. I mean, there was a Hellenic civilization. There were no nation states.
Right.
You know, you're talking 2,500 years ago. People would go to Sicily, and they had an academy there that was famous. You know, Pythagoras had an academy with geometry, and they were invaded by Persia, and they learned a lot of things from Persian myths. Mithra, and Persia had the biggest civilization in the world at one time. Wow. They were, and they had the Magi, and the Zoroastrian was fire worship. So I mean, a lot of people are just totally. None of this has ever really been put together and looked at from the principles of the mind's evolution.
So, do you think the Greeks were using these myths and maybe even some of the techniques they learned in India to awaken Kundalini?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's where the mysteries. You couldn't get in. In fact, talking about if you got into the mysteries to get initiated, you had to be celibate for a certain amount of days. You couldn't be a murderer. No murderers could get into it. There was no criminals. There was people who could pay to get into it, and there's other people, they let them in. But the mysteries at Elysius, I think it's called. But Plato comes right out and talks about reincarnation. And the thing is, all that has been, for 1,000 years, all the Gnostics and anybody who believed in reincarnation, they've either been killed or their ideas have been destroyed.
I mean, why do you think the secrecy, with like the mysteries and these secret schools to awaken Kundalini, like, because today the big challenge is bringing knowledge of Kundalini out to the world so people can understand our purpose for being here, our evolutionary goal, higher consciousness. But back then it was the exact opposite. There was a lot of effort done to hide it.
Well, I think it was to hide. Knowledge is power, and power can be misused. So knowledge of Kundalini can be misused to have mind control over other people. I mean, if you delve deep into the CIA techniques of mind control, it's all related to sexual abuse and Kundalini. And so who knows if the Romans knew about this, and that's how come they destroyed it and gave us this sort of fake religion. So
yeah, I know that, Kundalini is related to, in some people it can manifest in different ways, right? In some it can provide wisdom and insight into certain things. In some people, maybe charisma,
right.
And so I can see it in some cases, where someone becomes charismatic, very well spoken, and would like to abuse the power, something like that, where they would awaken Kundalini maybe in a distorted way, and then gain control over things that way. But I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's true. It's definitely true. I mean, Gopi Krishnan talks about the pranic spectrum. Then that if you don't have the right lifestyle, and that's just totally in all the fairy tales, because the first thing is they're missing their parents, and the second one is they have to leave a rich lifestyle. So like the child has to leave a castle, because they have to live out nature and be humble and live, use your body. And all these people who are after power and money, what happens if they have a raised Kundalini, it can only go up so far. It goes up to like their heart, or even not even that far. Then what happens, it falls back down to their lowest chakra or second chakra. Then they become like sexual demons. It's like they have no control over themselves. They're still smart. They're still highly, in fact, it is the people who are highly intellectual who destroy the civilization. It's not the workers who are digging ditches or building buildings or fixing cars. They're not destructive. It's the people at the very top, because they're burning their energy out. They're burning their brain cells. And what happens, instead of reforming themselves, they keep going on towards control and more control. And the people they don't care for, it's basically the worst form of communism. Just kill everybody who's intelligent, who's creative. And that's how come those societies eventually cannot survive. Because you can't survive without creative people.
And that's what I liked about the difference between you and Joseph Campbell, is that in one of his interviews, he does amazing interviews, and we have one here, The Power of Myth, with Bill Moyers. And I think Bill Moyers asked him, so like, do these myths, like, does the hero journey, how does that now look on a global scale? How do you apply this? And Joseph Campbell was kind of like, no, society, it's good as it is. You just gotta, keep at yourself and go through this process internally. It's not really for you to go out there and seek to change the structure or society. And that's kind of where, like, I was like, oh, Joseph Campbell,
He was an establishment guy. You can't blame him.
Right.
He was an atheist too. So why would he? How could see? The thing is, a lot of people who go through that education are atheists. This is just sort of out of their preview to interpret something from a different point of view that's spiritual, let alone that there's a force within everybody's body and mind that's controlling us. And we have rules to follow. Right. And if we don't, your brain deteriorates.
So we had a podcast. Our first podcast was about politics and just kind of the relationship between Kundalini and politics. And someone commented, they said, how is it that, living high on the horse, a super wealthy person, what does that have to do with anything? How could that be a bad thing if I'm super wealthy and have all these things? Why would that be bad for the Kundalini process? And for what you're saying, it sounds like, having that materialism kind of inset into your mind because of just your sheer wealth, right? You'd be in a way short-circuiting or contaminating the Kundalini process, it sounds like, and maybe, developing a highly evolved, very sharp intellect, but just slightly askew, where you then start serving to tear down society without maybe even really knowing it. You mentioned the intellectuals or the people on top are really the ones who end up tearing down a
Right.
society. Like, how does that work? Because you earlier you mentioned the myth of Little Red Riding Hood and
Mhm.
this sort of this wolf of materialism.
Yeah.
Like, how
Mhm.
does that, from your perspective, like how does that interfere with, I guess, the Kundalini process, and what could be like worst case scenario?
Mhm.
Well, there's so many worst case scenarios right now. Besides ecology, napalm, nuclear bombs, depleted uranium, GMOs. I
Yeah.
mean, if you think about it, we're supposed to be here to become enlightened and reach a higher state of consciousness, and you treat everybody as a god in the making, as a spiritual person. How can somebody, even if you're not a millionaire, just a regular person, go to church on Sunday, on Monday, he goes to the napalm factory and works on how to more efficiently destroy other human beings?
Exactly.
That you can't have that dichotomy in your brain. It just doesn't work. Something's going to be wrong there. And then when you have a whole society, look at America. Hate to say it, but what do we spend on defense? 600, 800 billion dollars a year.
Mm.
And, and that's to kill other people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's kind
that
of
shows you the chronic spectrum.
Mhm.
What I see this is really, and to me, it's Western civilization has become too technological,
Yeah.
and keeping your mind on technology all the time instead of living with nature, living in a simple life.
Yeah.
It actually destroys your nerve cells. You can't evolve right. And look at all the countries that Nazi Germany, they're the highest technological at the time. And they're the ones who started, World War II. Then look at Britain. They were very advanced technologically. They had they invaded India. They had guns and India didn't. And
The Hopi have a very interesting take. I was studying it for just a little bit. It's the power of the fire, the force of the fire, and not being able to be the proper holders of that fire because we are misguided, and so we got to balance all the other elements as well.
right.
And
Fire out of the elements, earth, water, fire, air. Fire has always been considered the foundation of reality. In in India they call it Agni, Heni,
mhm,
but that's the fire. They call it the serpent fire. Also, it's the purifying. Once it's raised, it purifies your body. It's the Cinderella sitting by the fireplace. She had
mhm,
to take care of the fireplace and keep the fire going all the time.
uh-huh.
That's Kundalini. You know, so you can go through all the different myths about the serpent. The Saint George, he had to kill the dragon, save the virgin, and get the gold. It's in a cave. Each one of those symbols, the virgin, the whole idea of the goddess, sexual energy, killing the serpent, which represents Kundalini, but that means conquering Kundalini.
Mhm.
Getting the gold is higher consciousness. There's prizes to higher consciousness. You can live long. Your body's supposed to be, you should live to over 100. You should be able to have all sorts of different talents. You should, if you look at all the different myths, every god brought back something. The god of agriculture, they brought back something to the people. That's what they're talking about.
Joseph, I'm interested. You said conquering Kundalini. Is there a myth, little story that you can share, or a fairy tale that you can share about that one?
Well, they're all like that. But
Or what?
basically, St. George and the Dragon is the most obvious. It's the very simplest one.
So I guess what I'm curious is how do you conquer Kundalini? Like, why is that necessary?
Well, the whole thing is it's very hard to bring upward to your top chakra. It takes years, maybe decades, because it has a tendency to fall down. And so many, because we're just evolving. If people knew about this and they followed the right path, it'd be easier.
Right.
But so Harry Potter's interesting.
Mm.
He goes down into the cave. I can't remember which one it was. And that big serpent comes out. He has to kill it with the sword.
Stone.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The sword and stone.
The sword and stone.
Yeah, that's the sword. The sword represents your spine. It's like Sir Arthur had the sword and sword, only he could pull it out.
Mm-hmm.
When he pulled it out of the stone is materialism, and the sword is your spine. And so he could wield a sword, which is the sword of truth or whatever, and nobody could overcome him. And there's a lot of those ideas of being born out of a stone, which is born out of materialism, that we evolved from the earth. Because there's the earth, you evolve from earth, then a lighter element, which is water, then air, then fire. Then it comes back down, fire to air to water to earth. But all the serpent myths almost all of them are about overcoming the forces of evolution. If you look at it in the bad way, because the serpent is not good or bad. It's sort of, people see the materialism of serpent of the world as bad, but really it's our job to bring the spirit into materialism.
Right.
So like Beowulf was the whole thing, was about overcoming the lower forces of the serpent. It's everywhere. I can't say exactly which one. Oh, well, there's the 11th is interesting. The 11th labor of Hercules was that he had to get the apples of immortality from the Garden of Hesperides. This is just like the Garden of Eden. And this is 2,000 years before the Bible was written. Okay. So the garden had these golden apples, and he was supposed to get those. So he had to kill a 100-headed serpent. I think his name was Landon or Ladon. So he killed a serpent and got the apples with help of Athena and some other ones, and brought them back as his 11th labor. Mm. So the whole, like the tree we have again is the spine, the apples, golden apples of immortality, and gold is representative of immortality also. Mm. It's all the different myths. They're going after the gold, and the serpent guards the gold.
So I'm kind of imagining this, like it sounds like the purpose of evolution is maybe twofold in your view. Like one is we all come out of the physical, right, and the material. And when we're young, that's kind of all that we experience. We don't have this transcendental aspect of life. Mm-hmm. The idea there is to, in some ways, break ourselves free of just pure materialism and now start moving towards transcendental, lofty, divine thoughts, ideas, life experience. But on the other hand, it sounds like once you get there, you can't just remain there in the bliss. That really, to serve this process, you now have to bring knowledge or wisdom now back down to, to your own life experience, integrate it, and now you can perhaps even share that with the world. So it's kind of this upward and then downward movement is what I hear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And not just spiritualize your bodies, the whole human race catches on. It's like one candle lighting another candle. Right. That's the story of Christ, really, too. I mean, he dies, goes up to heaven, goes back down to hell. But the whole idea is, he goes up and back down.
So that's kind of maybe like when I was asking you earlier, how do you conquer the serpent? That's kind of like, I think, once you've awakened the serpent, the Kundalini energy, you now yourself through, and this is probably like the purpose of religions, the whole stories behind it. Exactly. Is you have guidelines, there's a path for you, there's certain behavioral, psychological attributes that you must inherit to use that to control the power that Kundalini provides you. And that now it's within your, I don't want to say command, but it's in your will of how you use it.
Yeah. So why are all these moral guidelines, I guess, in place? Because, you have the story of the myth, but then you seem to have this layer of morality on top of it, you know, eschewing or eschewing, materialism, uh, you know, making sure you're truthful in the way that you conduct yourself. Like, why is that additional moral layer kind of in the myths, and why is it so
Mm,
important to this evolutionary
like not giving
process?
into temptation and those kinds of things.
Well, think of it if you had a group of people and you had someone who was smarter than everybody else and he didn't have any morals.
Ah, that would suck.
Think what would happen. Well, just look around.
Yeah.
Look, this is what we have.
Yeah.
You have, like I said, depleted uranium. We're spending more on destructive processes than we are on building and creativity.
Mhm.
That's what you're going to have, because people put aside. They think it's a quaint little thing to be moral and not lie and just go after, because that also is built on a myth that you get everything you can get because you only have this one life and that's the end of it.
Mm,
So
mhm.
that's also on a subconscious basis that people think, well, I'm just going to get what I want, because they're attached to their physical senses.
Their
And they
head.
don't, your mental or your spirit has different rules than your physical senses. Just like I want to go out and eat pizza and chocolate and drink beer. Well, you know you're going to get a reaction, right? Next day, you're going to be sick in bed. Well, the same thing with your mind. I want to go out and watch a slasher film, and then I want even subtle things. Then I want to go out and screw somebody, and it goes on and on and on. That's going to come back and hit the person, and the brain cells just don't evolve right, and especially people who are after so much power to do anything and lie and cheat and steal.
Yeah.
Now, Gopi Krishna seemed to think that there was a path to evolution, and that it was this higher intelligence was kind of guarding this path and watching every little action that occurred on this plane and even in our own minds, very closely. And that in order for us to move forward on the path, we had to maintain this certain, let's say, balance, or
Mm-hmm.
moral, moral upliftment. And if we cultivated those things, then we could move forward in evolution. And if we didn't, like you were talking about earlier, then this process of Kundalini awakening can become corrupted, and lead us in the
Mm-hmm.
wrong direction, maybe even towards self-annihilation.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I mean, he has this CD about why civilizations fall, but you can see that in your own life. Like, I was at a friend's house and he's on a farm. I just visited him, and it was really a beautiful place. And I stayed there once or twice and worked with him. He's got his kids. He's trying to do organic, and it was sort of weird. I went to sleep, and right during that next morning, this gigantic like gold light just exploded in my head,
Mm.
and it was pretty interesting.
Mhm.
It's hard to explain.
When was this?
Just recently, but this has happened to me many times where I'm getting emotional.
Yeah, no worries. That's beautiful. So I'm assuming that it left you in a state of reverence.
Well, those type of experiments, whatever, those experiences, they just leave you changed, a little step at a time. Everybody thinks that's, it's one time. It just, each time I did something to help other people, inside me, the energy would flow.
Yeah.
I remember going to, it was a soup kitchen. This is back in the 30s, when I was in 30. I had a Kundalini awakening when I was like 29, 30. A couple months after that, I went to a soup kitchen. I just helped out for one day. The next week, my whole energy changed. It was like I had pretty bad posture. All of a sudden, my spine was like straight as a sword, you know,
Mm.
and the energy was just flowing.
Mm.
And so like there's a reward for helping other people out
So being
once this
a
energy is going.
interesting. So maybe that's where, when overabundance is harmful, like, even though, like, I'm thinking about that comment that you mentioned earlier. Now I could see why having a certain amount of wealth could be beneficial, because now you're not you have the help, I guess. The society functions through money, and if you have enough money to have people to help you around the house, help you with the kids, if you're a parent, help you with the food.
Mind is free of the burden.
Exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But that's part of the problem. How can one person be free of the burden? There's like what, 10% own 90% of all the wealth. So the other 90% are not free of the burden.
No.
Exactly.
And so that's destroying our evolutionary possibilities.
Yeah.
It'd be easier because money is just a means of exchange.
Right.
And one person is not worth $1 billion, no matter what they say, because they have millions of people working for them who are doing, there's poor people working 2-3 jobs just to survive. And here they are taking in all the rewards.
Yeah.
And there's so much stuff that's been hidden from us. That's the biggest problem right now is that the human mind will deteriorate, and we're faster and faster. Not so is our ecology deteriorating because we don't know how to live with nature.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that, going back to your experience, Joseph, I remember one of Gopi's saying is, just, what did he say? 1 million hours of service would change
Yeah.
the world from everybody, total, I
I
guess.
think it was 1 billion.
1 billion
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
1 hour, there's 7 billion people. 1 hour a week
for her.
would everybody be 7 billion hours,
Yeah.
right?
And it sounds so simple, and it's such a, tiny, thing to give, but yet here we are, just continue being lost in our ways and being so greedy and selfish and saying, "No,
Well,
I worked so hard for this."
well, it is changing. I mean, I could see changes. I mean, back in the 50s, they have all this thing about people. If you watch some TV, the whole idea where everybody's like always hugging each other and
Yeah.
trying to help people who need, it's like a big thing. And I could see the changes coming. I mean, but it's slow. And everybody knows that there's something wrong, but they just don't know where the next step is. I think we're like in the gap from jumping from one cliff to another cliff. We're like right in the center here, where there's just, if we don't make it to the other side, we just fall down.
I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate, or just putting myself in the perspective of the creator or an intelligent energy, right? So, million years ago, the worst thing that we had against each other was, a stick and a stone.
Mm-hmm.
And, with the Industrial Revolution, now you have mechanized weapons.
Right.
In a nuclear age, now you have nuclear weapons. But at the same time that all this weaponry is being developed, there's also advances in nutrition, in
Right.
in healthcare, in our understanding of the body, and and those types of things. So we're advancing. At the same time, we're gaining sort of creative control over our universe, both for constructive purposes. Joseph, you had mentioned the military budgets. I imagine what this world would look like if even half of that was invested back into curing the common cold, or or the flu, or anything like that. And now we're entering into a new phase where it seems like the development of our mind, of our of our ability to transcend in many ways our physical experience. So it seems like
Mm-hmm.
we're coming into even a new plane, perhaps with new power and new responsibilities, but there has to be a corresponding moral upliftment as well. In a nuclear age, we can't have megalomaniacs running around.
Mm-mm.
The damage that they could do would be incalculable. And maybe as we move forward into even further states of evolution, we're going to
Mm-hmm.
need and even higher moral upliftment. So to me, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying about, yeah, having that these acts of kindness, of compassion, of balance, you know, are so important because really for our survival, not necessarily for, you know, yes,
getting
for moral upliftment,
oh,
but even
getting to heaven or somewhere. It's like it's more permanent right down here. It's like just to be a happy person, contented person, because you can be filled with a billion race cars and jets and everything, and you're just the same old grumpy old man, you know.
Mhm.
It,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
what? So what good is it? I mean,
I
the whole thing about technology is like our new god, the new phone, the new TV, the new movie. Well, those are new, but the same person. You're still the same person. How about changing who you are?
Yeah.
And if the movie doesn't come out or a phone, you're still the
Yeah.
whole idea is to work on yourself constantly
I
to become
always
more conscious and aware.
Yeah, I always tell my boys when they're asking me for the latest or just a toy, and I'm like, "It's not what you have, it's not where you've been, it's not, what you know, it's who you are." This me not getting you this is not gonna change who you are. In fact, it might even build your persona even better now because now you didn't get what you wanted all the time.
I imagine a world where, in school when you're young, you're taught from a young age the source of happiness, where that is. You know,
Right.
you're taught that you can have everything in the world and still be the most miserable person that there is, but that there's this endless source of happiness within that you can tap into if you just follow the guidance that was laid out in these myths, which it seems like to me these myths that you study, Joseph, are kind of like bubbling up from our subconscious,
Exactly. I
they,
think they're coming down from our higher consciousness.
yeah.
Yeah.
And well, the interesting that I found out is that the myths have the deepest negativity within the human race and the highest spiritual matters. You
Mhm.
can go anywhere from cannibalism to incest to everything that needs to be reformed. At the same time, there's the idea of being on the path.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So it's bringing up from our lowest. So I think a lot of the things that are in fairy tales could be mentioned in proper society about incest and sex. So they put it in fairy tales,
Uh,
and they hid it as children. And even at the same thing, maybe in the future, we're going to see that we've been treating our children terribly. You
mhm.
know,
Yeah.
the way we put them in these little school factories, and the boys are just dying out basically. I mean, I can't even sit 8 hours on a hard chair and listen to somebody lecture. How do you expect young kids? I mean, that's sort of like a jail in one sense.
Yeah, that's why
It's
I
not the
home
proper way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why Linda homeschools.
I do. It's really tough. It's really tough on me. In fact, I was just talking to my cousins yesterday, and I was like, it would be so liberating for me not to have these boys at home. And with the time it would give me, and my cousins are like, "Then why don't you do it?" And I said, they think that it's better for them. They're like, "It'll be better for them." I'm like, this is where I differ. It won't be better for them. This is my sacrifice for them to be healthy individuals. But it's really tough. It's really tough.
Yeah, that's where they used to have extended families.
Exactly. That's why it's
Schools,
so tough. I'm alone.
national schools were not. This is just a recent thing. You
Yeah.
know, years before, people would just work around the farm and they'd learn reading and writing but the whole idea was they have an extended family. I think in the future, you could have groups of people get together when you have maybe 5 or 10 kids, and each person takes time teaching them different ideas,
Yes,
different things.
I will see the benefit of that.
Kind of tribal living.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not
community.
sure why the school system started as is, but I know that, when they started colonizing here, they to force the natives to take away their culture, their identity, they started
Yeah.
taking the children away and putting them in boarding schools, um, and schooling them in English and in these ways.
I'm just thinking about, the scalability of our society today. You have,
Yeah.
you live in a city with millions of people. You don't know who your neighbor is.
Right.
You don't know
Right.
who lives above you or below you or next to you or anything. People hardly say hi on the street.
Yeah.
But now you live in a society where there's 15 people, 20 people. Well, you say hi to everybody. You know everybody. Everybody knows everything that's going on, and it's a much more tightly knit, society. So it's like, when I say like tribal living, it's almost like, you know, maybe scaling back in both the technology and also how we're like structuring society. Seems like it might be a little bit more healthy for our evolution in some ways.
Oh, yeah, but,
You know, yeah. The problem is we don't use our intelligence. It's like a consumer society where money is not intelligent. Money is a means of exchange, and the idea that money is going to determine, the size of the school, this and that, and all these other things. So we got to look at it an entirely different way of planning, where people are free to get together. And the whole idea of like forcing people to be in one school or another school or this or that, and it just goes on and on. It's like you have to change the whole system at once. You
exactly.
can't change one part of it.
Exactly.
The money system has to change instead of people just printing up. Well, something like 30% of our economy has to do with money exchange. The stock market, loaning money, and that doesn't produce anything. It's non-productive. It's like people. The productive part is economy is food, education, housing, communication. I said educate. Well, transportation. In other words, if you had those 5 things, you would have a society, and you wouldn't even need money for that matter. If those things were done in a proper way, it'd only take about 10% of what we're doing now, instead of 90. Because look, 60% goes to defense, 30% goes to financials, and we can live with all the rest: the food, the money, the clothing, all that. That's what everybody's works for.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I'm trying to say? It's
There's a lot of inefficiencies, right?
Yeah.
That we just.
But we're saying it's gigantic. It's like 80 or 90% inefficient because of our morality. Because there's people making money off lending fake money, or it's produced out of nowhere. It's like we're subsidizing it.
But if you give someone a big screen TV and a car with air conditioning,
right?
They'll accept pretty much whatever.
Some good entertainment.
They'll accept pretty much whatever society gives them, even if they're working 12 hours a day, as long as they can go back and sit there and relax. There's no impetus, or motivation to like change the way that they live.
Yeah. Everything's
Well, I think each generation it does change. There's always the youngest generation is always causing trouble because, like we said, the older one passes away. They lose their power, and they hold on to it. It's like King Herod tried to kill Christ, and Pharaoh tried to kill Moses. Then it goes on and on like that. In the myths that the former kings and queens try to keep their power at all cost.
right.
And so we're just so dumbed down. We don't know that there's such a future out there that's so far beyond what anybody can imagine. Because that goes back to the myths too. The people think this is one life and that's the end of it. And I don't think it's going to change unless we get the information out that there's this force that's pushing us to another higher level of awareness. And if we don't follow it, we're just going to have more of the same and even worse. You could always have war.
Well, I think talks like this definitely help. And, we're just about at time right now, but I think this was a great conversation.
It really was.
And I hope that that people look into Joseph's work again. It's mythicspiral.com.
Mm-hmm.
And he has some blog posts there that'll hopefully change your perspective on these myths and kind of show that really they are pointing to these greater processes that are happening, these evolutionary processes and these very profound internal truths.
Yes.
And so Joseph, just wanted to thank you for coming
so
on and for your work in mythology. It's definitely been a help to Linda and I.
Oh, yeah.
I know you served on the board of the Emerging Sciences Foundation and kind of got things going there, and just all your contributions have just been very very informative and transformational, definitely to both Linda and I. So just wanted to say thank you and just share our appreciation.
It's really an honor to have you here with us today, Joseph. Thank you.
We're going to both work together on this for a long time. So
yes, of course.
I'll be back again.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much, Joseph. We'll go ahead and end the broadcast. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Okay.